is the story of Willow Run, one of the Ford farms that virtually overnight became the largest aircraft plant that had ever been built. A story that now can be told in full.
We're presently in what is known as Hangar 1 at Willow Run Airport. We're in Bay 8. And if we look out at about a 45-degree angle from here, we see the two doors where the bombers would come off the assembly line after they were built. There's a lot of stories that lead up to the building of this factory. With the war in Europe turning hot, when the Blitzkrieg took place in the Low Countries, the U.S. was totally unprepared. So Roosevelt went to Congress and said the U.S. must build 50,000 airplanes to protect itself. Then in the fall of 1940, the Battle of Britain took place, and the bombers were devastating England. And it came out that bombers would be the way that you'd have to fight World War II. And all the auto companies were given projects to build engines and airplane parts. Ford Motor Company was given the B-24 bomber, which was a problematic airplane. It was the newest airplane we had. It was still in development stages, and they wanted to mass produce this airplane. So Ford said, I'm not just going to build parts, I'll build complete airplanes. That was Henry Ford speaking for his company. And in January of '41, his chief production guy, a guy named Charles Sorensen, went out to San Diego, California to watch how Consolidated was building the B-24 bomber. And what he saw for a production guy was just out of this world. They were building them by hand, one at a time, every airplane, an individual handcrafted masterpiece. And he said, you'll never build a lot of airplanes this way. And Ford can't help you because Ford builds everything the same and you guys build it different. So he went back to his hotel room at the Coronado Hotel in San Diego. And he stayed up all night. And in the back of 42 placemats, he drew the Willow Run bomber plant where we are today. And he went back the next morning. He told the Army, he told Consolidated, Ford Motor Company can build one B-24 bomber an hour on an automotive-style assembly line. The U.S. was so desperate that without even asking how you could do this, they said, start the project. And they allocated $200 million to build this factory, the largest single allocation in the history of the U.S. government at that time. And they broke the ground on this plant in April of 1941. They broke ground on the airport at the same time, and by November of '41, the factory was producing parts.
This 80-acre plant was built in record time. In reality, it was made into two plants under one roof, a manufacturing plant and an assembly plant.
This was the largest single factory under one roof ever produced in the world when this plant was designed. The plant was originally designed to have about 60,000 employees. They never got above 42,000 because of the logistics of living here and getting the people in the plant. And when they were in peak production, there was only about 17,000 employees in this factory. And between January and June of 1944, 35% of the four-engine bombers built in the United States were delivered here at Willow Run, and that was one of 11 factories building the B-24 bomber.
Of course, this was something new in assembly, not just another relatively simple automobile with only 15,000 or so parts to be made and assembled. Each of these machines is made up of 1,225,000 parts.
What they did was they took what had been done as individual pieces, and they took the engineering drawings, and they designed it to hold the tolerances of 2/10,000ths of an inch. And then a massive press would knock out thousands of these pieces that would then go onto the assembly line, and basically unskilled assembly workers with just a little bit of training could assemble these airplanes. And all the pieces were precise. You could interchange any part with any Ford-built B-24 bomber and it would fit because they had fit them to blueprints like cars. The rest of the aircraft industry still used a lot of hand fabrication to complete their airplanes.
At Ford's Willow Run near Detroit, manpower shortage had early become a problem. From its overworked trackless trains to its assembly line, the need for workers had risen sharply.
There was a shortage of manpower, so the women started to come into the workforce, And even by May of 42, before production started, women made up about 20% of the workforce here at Willow Run. And the women didn't get drafted, and the women didn't volunteer to go into the service like the men did. So they tended to come in here and stay. So as the employees turned over, it was on the male side, and the females stayed in here. By the end of the war, 40% of the production workers here in the factory were women.
Not peeping Toms, but riveters, learning how and where to put the 700,000 rivets that go into a single Liberator bomber.
Well, there was a girl named Rose Monroe that came out of Kentucky, moved up here to take the job at the factory. And there was promotion out in Hollywood about the women in the defense industry, but they picked this girl, and because her name was Rosie, it kind of tacked on to Rosie the Riveter, and she became the prototype for that female production worker during World War II. Well, the Willow Run Bomber Plant is a project that the Yankee Air Museum is involved in. We want to save a part of this plant and make it a display of what happened in World War II, how the auto industry stepped forward in a time of need to really save the world.
The Willow Run plant is in the process right now of being demolished. You can see the two big hangar doors behind me. Those hangar doors represent the end of the plant, the end of the assembly line, where 8,700 B-24s rolled out. We intend to save that, restore a piece of the building, about 175,000 square feet, move the Yankee Air Museum into it, and show people what the history of this was all about in the 1940s. Something for us to remember and save for our kids and grandkids to see. When Ford Motor Company was finished with bomber production in 1945, they cleared the plant out, and in 1947 it was purchased by the Kaiser Frazer Company. Kaiser Frazer came in and used the plant both for their automobiles. They built roughly 800,000 automobiles here, Kaiser Frazers, Henry J's, Graham Motor Company was involved in it. As I said, about 800,000 automobiles were built, but also most people know of the B-24 bomber plant and the B-24s that were built here. Very few people know that we also had C-119 flying boxcars built here. Roughly 200 of them were built here in the early 1950s. After Kaiser Frazer was done with their automobiles and their aircraft production, General Motors bought the plant. They had lost one of their transmission facilities to a fire, and they saw this plant. It was empty at the time they purchased it, and have owned it ever since then until 2010, when it became vacant after the General Motors bankruptcy. Right now, if you look inside the facility, there's not much in there. There's a lot of the manufacturing equipment left from General Motors on the floor. That is slowly being cleared out. Once it's cleared out and the power is restored to it again, you'll be able to see that it looks just like it did in 1942. This end of the building was never restored. The other end of the bomber plant was restored a number of years ago and modernized by General Motors, but this end hasn't. The original plant was 3.5 million square feet. It is now roughly 5 million square feet with the General Motors additions that were put on over the years. We intend to save about 175,000 square feet. So it really is a very insignificant piece of the entire plant. But as I said earlier, it represents the most significant piece of the arsenal of democracy because it's where the bombers rolled out. We intend to move the entire Yankee Air Museum into it someday. We can get all of our airplanes into it except our B-52. We'll use it for a hangar for the other airplanes, the flyable airplanes that we have in this hangar. Initially, we're looking at raising about $8 million. That money is needed to bring the building back up to code and essentially make it a functional building. By the time we're done, we'll have probably put $15 million, possibly more, into the building. Of the $8 million we need to raise up front, we have $2.5 million left.
This ship is strong, with strength built in by skilled brains and hands, with all the experience that Ford has gained over the years of mass production.
Detroit's had some rough times over the last 10 years or so, and especially in the last couple years. But this is something that Detroiters and people from southeastern Michigan and northern Ohio, all the people that supported this plant, worked in it, and the companies that supported the production here, this is something that we can look back at and we can smile about. We did something here in Detroit that was not done anywhere else in the world, and it literally saved the world from the Axis powers.